Hello, friends. Welcome to the September Shine recap message. So I'm having to do this today. There's something going on with my mic on my phone. So I've got this just to have better quality and better sound, or else it's going to sound like I'm in a wind tunnel. So don't mind this. But this is going to be the recap of September. Now, if you remember, I told you guys in August that this was a two-part message. Today is part 2 of August message. So just a quick recap. If you remember in August, we talked about is why we are here on earth. It is our job to disciple a nation. So we really talked about what that looks like to disciple a nation and what it looked like when Jesus called his first disciple, Simon Peter, right? And remember, we talked about the story when Jesus gets on his boat and asks him to push out a little bit, and then goes out and has him catch a large number of fish. And Simon gets so scared of the blessing that he falls at Jesus' feet and he says, "Away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." Okay, so we really talked about that of when God calls us to do something, when God calls us to be a disciple, how in that moment, Simon saw himself as Simon. He had been fishing all morning. He was pulling his boat up on shore, washing his nets, getting ready to go home for the day because he felt like a failure when Jesus stepped on the scene. But we really talked about when he fell at Jesus' feet in that moment, it was because he saw himself as Simon, the failure. But when Jesus stepped on Simon's boat, he saw Peter, the rock on which I will build my church. Okay, so remember last month, this is just a recap, we talked about you don't even know who you are. You don't even know who you are yet. When we see ourselves in the mirror, just like Simon saw himself as Simon, Jesus saw Peter. God sees something so much in you, and that's when he comes to you and he calls you. I really also challenge you guys to figure out where you were in that story. If that was your boat, what does Jesus need to do? Do you need to allow Jesus to get on your boat? Do you need to push out a little? Are you sitting on the shore, super comfy in the shallow end, and you just need to push out a little? Take the first step. Take the leap of faith. Just do something that Jesus is asking you to do. Or I asked you to figure out if Jesus is calling you out into deeper water, right? Because if we are to disciple a nation and we are to be a fisher of men and go out and tell the world about Jesus, we have to get out in the deep end because that's where the fish are, okay? So I really challenge you guys to figure out where you are at in that story and ask God, who do you see? Who am I? Because just like when Simon saw Simon, Jesus saw Peter. Ask God, who am I, Lord? Who do you see? What am I becoming? And then to figure out where you were in that story and the boat and where he's asking you, okay? But I talked to you guys about the very end of that message in August that I was going to continue this story, that even though God calls us, even though God changes Simon's name to Peter and he becomes the rock, that Simon Peter is still human and he is still flawed. And even when Jesus calls him out to walk on water, he still begins to sink. So this is where we're going to pick up today. And I am just going to take this message and I'm going to shrink it up just to give you the meat and potatoes of the message. So this isn't a really long video. So really quick, I want to take you guys to Matthew 16:15 through 19, when Jesus actually changes Simon's name to Peter. It says, Jesus is talking to Simon in this moment, and it says, "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it." Can you imagine getting that kind of declaration over your life? Remember, just a couple verses ahead, Simon was falling at Jesus' feet saying, "Away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." And now Jesus turns around and he's changing Simon's name to Peter, and he's telling him, "You are the rock on which I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it." That is a big calling on somebody's life, okay? But what I really want to bring in today is that even though this is who Jesus says Simon Peter is, even the calling that he has on his life, he is still human. Because here's the thing. Before Jesus stepped on the scene, he was just Simon, failing, a fisherman in a boat catching no fish. After Jesus, Simon Peter does end up becoming the rock, okay? But it's through a process. So I want to take you guys to the scene that I talked about at the end of last month when Jesus calls Simon Peter out to walk on water and what that looks like. In Matthew 14:22, Jesus walks on water. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side. While he dismissed the crowd, after he dismissed them, he went up to the mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Simon Peter replied, "tell me to come to you out on the water." "Come," Jesus said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on water, and came towards Jesus. How stinking cool is that? But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and he began to sink, and he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why are you so afraid?" And then they climbed into the boat and the wind died down. Okay, so I really want you guys to pay attention to this because this is so true for all of our lives. Jesus calls Peter. He changes his name. Jesus calls Peter out on water. Jesus walks on water with Jesus. How stinking cool would that be? But what happens? He starts to doubt and he starts to sink and he has to say, "Lord, save me." Because what happened here? He got distracted. He lost his focus on Jesus and he got distracted and he started looking at the winds and the waves on the left and on the right of him. Have you ever had that happen? Have you ever gotten distracted by everything that's going around you and what's going on in the world, that you get distracted and you lose your focus of Jesus and you start to sink? It happens, you guys. We're all human. If that's happened to you, it's okay. You're in good company. This was Peter, the very first disciple that Jesus called to walk with him on earth. And he still got distracted. He still started looking around and got distracted, lost his focus of Jesus and started to sink. But here's the thing. This isn't the first storm that Peter found himself in with Jesus. Just a couple verses before this, the disciples find themselves in a storm again with Jesus. And the winds and the waves come up and they're like, "Lord, save us. We're going to drown." And Jesus is sleeping. He's sleeping. Have you ever been in a storm and you feel like Jesus is sleeping and you're like, "Excuse me, Jesus, could you please wake up? I'm going through something right now and I could really have you come in and just calm this storm." And he's sleeping. But here's the thing, Jesus is Jesus. He knows exactly what it is and he can sleep through a storm. And they said, "Lord, save us. We're going to drown." Here's the cool thing. If you go back and read this story when Peter goes out on water, something changes. I feel like Peter learned something from the first storm he was in with Jesus to the second storm, because this time he doesn't say, "Lord, save me, I'm going to drown." He just says, "Lord, save me." He knows that God will save him now. And he just says, he reaches out his hand and says, "Lord, save me." And instantly, Jesus reaches out his hand and he says, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" And here's our problem, you guys. It's us. It's us doubting. It's us getting distracted and looking to the left and right and losing our focus on Jesus. This is why we start to sink. It has nothing to do with who God is and everything to do with who we are and our doubts and our failures. Jeremiah 29:11 says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope for a future." God has a plan for your life. God has big plans for you and he's not going to let you sink and he's not going to let you fail. But guess what? You have to keep focus on Jesus and quit getting distracted by the rest of the world. Because here's the thing. What happens when we doubt? Here's another person that doubted Jesus, that God also changed his name and created a huge covenant with this person. And they doubted. And they took matters into their own hands and stuff got really messy. Let's go all the way back to Genesis for a second and talk about Abraham and Sarah. God made a promise to them. God made a covenant with them that they were going to have a child, a son. and that nations would come from Abraham. But in this moment, Abraham is in his 80s, Sarah's in her 90s. God makes this promise, and Abraham actually laughs at God. Have you ever had God share something with you and you laughed at him? I have personally. When God told me years ago that I was going to be in ministry, I laughed. And I remember specifically saying, and I talked just like Moses, send somebody else, Lord, I do not speak well. And I remember laughing. I never wanted to be on stage. I never wanted to work in a church and be part of the whole political part of it. And I actually laughed at God in that moment. But that's okay because I'm human. So were Abraham and Sarah. Abraham laughed at God when God gave him the promise and the covenant that a son would come from him. They doubted so much that they took matters into their own hands. And if you don't know this story, Sarah, Abraham's wife, actually got tired of waiting on God and gave Abraham her maidservant, Hagar. Abraham got the maidservant pregnant so that they could have a baby. And then Sarah has the nerve and the audacity to get mad and bitter because now Hagar has Abraham's baby and sends her away. You know, it's funny, people tell me all the time that I have a way of making the Bible come to life like a soap opera. Y'all, if you read your Bible, it is a soap opera. Like, that right there is straight out of a Jerry Springer show, right? That kind of like drama. They took matters in their own hands and doubted God so much that they messed everything up. But they didn't, because God still loved them and God still chose them, and God still, when God makes a promise, it will come to fruition. God still blessed Abraham and Sarah after they had taken matters in their own hands. And God created nations from Abraham. This is where it all began. The genealogy of Jesus started here, even though they were human, even though they took matters in their own hands, and even though they messed up as much as they did. So if you've messed up your life like that, you're in good company, and it's okay, and God still loves you, and he can still use you. Here's a cool thing that I want to teach you guys about Abraham and Sarah, because just like Simon Peter, God changed their names too. But what's really cool is when God changed Simon's name, he changed it to Peter. There was a complete name shift. When he changes Abraham and Sarah's name from Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah, God created them. God knew exactly who they were. Abram means exalted father. Abraham means father of multitude. So it's almost like God took who Abraham already was and made like a 2.0 version. Like, he's already a father, but instead of being just an exalted father, now he's going to become an exalted father of multitudes. Okay? So here's the thing. With Abraham, you're a father, but now God is going to take you and spread you to become a father of multitudes. Just like Simon Peter. Simon Peter was a fisherman. And then Jesus stepped on scene and he says, well, now I'm going to make you a fisher of men. And you see how God does that? God could take something and someone that we already are and expand it and make it even better in a 2.0 version. I just learned something very interesting and I want to share this with you guys. The letter H in the Bible and in Hebrew, it stands for Yahweh. The sound H is like Yahweh. Okay. If you don't know the name of God, Yahweh, I really want you to hold on to this. It is one of my favorite names for God in the Bible. And what Yahweh to me means is like you're at the end of your rope. You have nothing left. And you are like, God, you have no words. You can't even pray. Like, you're at the end of your rope. And in that sigh, and I've heard it said before, that sigh is the thing that God hears the absolute loudest, because he knows you're at your wit's end. But here's the cool thing about Yahweh, okay? Because as you are breathing out life and you are at your rope and you are like, I've got nothing left, that is when Yahweh comes in and breathes life back into you and makes you new and makes you whole and makes you a new creation. And I think that's exactly what happens here with Abraham and Sarah, because if you pay attention, when God changes their name from Abram to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah, what is the one thing he adds to their name? It's an H. It's like like Yahweh has come in and breathed new life in them and given them a fresh start. That's how cool our God is, you guys. That is amazing. And then God goes on to fulfill the promise that he made in the covenant. But let's go back to Simon Peter for a second, because that 2.0 version of you is going to require extreme focus on Jesus. Just like Simon Peter, when he comes out to walk on water with Jesus, it takes extreme focus on Jesus to walk on water, because the minute he loses focus and starts looking around, he starts to sink. Here's the thing. If you are in that close of a relationship with Jesus that you can walk on water with him, anybody who's ever been in a close-knit relationship knows you're going to fight. If you are in that close of a relationship, have you ever watched the movie The Shack? One of my very favorite scenes in that movie is they almost do an imitation of this very story. And the man who is portraying Jesus in the movie takes a man out on water, and they start to walk on water again. Well, the man gets excited and he starts to walk a little faster and gets ahead of Jesus, and he starts to sink, portraying pretty much this story, right? And he looks back at the man who's portraying Jesus in the movie, and it's my favorite part, because the man, Jesus, just looks at him and he goes, "It works better if we do it together." I love that line. That line has stuck with me. That's a relationship with Jesus. It works better when you stay focused on Jesus and you do it together. But here's the thing. When you're in that close of a relationship with Jesus, you're going to fight with him. You're going to wrestle. Have you ever wrestled with Jesus? I have. You guys have to remember, the relationship with us and Jesus Christ is a bridegroom relationship. He is the bridegroom and we are the bride. It is a marriage covenant between us and God. So just like any marriage, I'll be 100% honest, I fight with my husband. We have a really, really good marriage, but every once in a while, we get into a tussle. We get into a confrontation or a wrestle, because any good, strong relationship that you are in, you will wrestle. If you have never wrestled with God, I would really pay attention to, are you in true relationship with Jesus? Okay? Because here's another person that actually got blessed and his name was changed because he wrestled with God. Jacob. And I'm not going to go into the whole story. I want you guys to actually go back and read it, but let me tell you where it's at really quick. In Genesis 32:22, Jacob wrestles with God. I want you guys to go back and actually read that story. I'm not going to go into it, but it's in the wrestle with God that God changes his name and blesses him. And he changes his name from Jacob to Israel. God blesses Jacob because of the wrestle. If you have ever wrestled with God or fought with God, it's okay. You're human. You're in good company, because sometimes in that wrestle, God will bless you too. And it is okay. But here's a couple cool things. Go back and read the story because it's really important. Here's a couple cool things that we can learn from Jacob's story. One, we all mess up and need forgiveness and the mercy of God. Two, you have to have perseverance and toughness in the struggle. In that story, Jacob, as he's wrestling with God, he says, "I will not let go until you bless me." Have you ever been to that point where you are so at the end of your rope and you don't know what else to do except for to cling to God for dear life and say, "I will not let go until you bless me"? That's okay. That's human. And guess what? Because of that toughness and that perseverance in Jacob, God does end up blessing him and changing his name to Israel. After this, after God changes Jacob's name to Israel, God constantly has to remind Jacob of his new name. Over and over. If you keep reading Jacob's story over and over, he keeps trying to go back to Jacob. And God keeps having to remind him of his new name. You are no longer Jacob, you are Israel. Have you ever need God to come in and remind you who you are? Have you ever forgotten who you are and needed God to come in and remind you, or godly people to come in and remind you who you are? That's okay, because you're human and you're in good company. It's okay to need God to remind you who you are. So let's go back to Simon Peter for just a second, because Simon Peter even needed to be reminded who he was. Simon Peter forgot so much who he was. He forgot who Jesus was. Okay, this is the Simon Peter who walked with Jesus for 3 years. The first disciple, the fisher of men, did all these miracles with Jesus, watched Jesus do all these miracles, walked on water, even to the point when they came to crucify Jesus. Simon Peter believed in Jesus so much that he cut off a guard's ear trying to protect Jesus. Okay, but then what happens? The very next thing, he denies Jesus 3 times. Have you ever been there? Why? Why did Simon Peter deny Jesus? Because he got afraid of society, of what they do. Were they going to kill him? Were they going to crucify you? Remember, it's the same thing. He was looking to the right and the left and lost focus on Jesus and forgot who he was and forgot who Jesus was, to the point that he denied him 3 times. Simon Peter is human. If you have ever been to that point, it's okay. You're in good company. Because here's the coolest thing about the story. Our God is a God of a redemption story. After Jesus dies and gets crucified and was raised up again, he comes back to Simon Peter in almost the same way that he came to him in the very beginning, when he calls him out on the boat. He's fishing and caught nothing. Simon Peter once again jumps in the water for Jesus. And it's almost like Jesus recreated the whole story from the first time he called Simon Peter as a disciple. He almost recreates that same story in one instance. But here's the cool thing. Jesus gives Simon Peter an opportunity to redeem himself. And the 3 times that Simon Peter denied him, he asked, Simon Peter, do you love me? And he fully redeemed him. Have you ever needed the redemption of God? Have you ever messed up and needed a redemption story for God? For him to come in and ask you, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? That's okay, because so did Simon Peter. He was human, just like us. And if you have ever been there, it is okay. You are in good company. But here's the thing, you guys. Simon Peter, Abraham, Jacob, anybody in this story that I've told you guys today, that God changed their name and used them in powerful, mighty ways to bless the kingdom and to further the kingdom of God, that were just human, messy people that messed up and were flawed. Here's the coolest thing. Simon Peter had to go through everything he went through, all the trials, all the tribulations, all the storms, because God had to strengthen him. God had to teach him something through all of this. God had to give him opportunity to live up to the name, the rock, on which I will build my church. Do you see how cool that is? I'm not saying God caused all of it. I'm not saying Jesus caused everything that Simon Peter had to go through. I think some of that was his natural humanity. We mess up. We're flawed. We all need mercy and grace, and we are all saved by the goodness of God. God did not create all of this, but God is such a God of a redemption story. God is such an amazing God that he used every one of those opportunities to strengthen and toughen Peter up to actually live up to the name that he had already called him, the rock on which I will build my church. The gates of hell will not overcome. Simon Peter, in his humanness, in his flawedness, had to go through all of those things. And now at the end of his story, he actually becomes that man. He becomes the rock, the bedrock preacher of the church, goes on to write multiple New Testament books of the Bible. He becomes the rock. So we take Simon Peter, who was a scared fisherman, feeling like a failure in his own flesh, to Jesus steps on the scene, and little by little walking with Jesus, focusing on Jesus, not getting distracted left and right, Jesus helps turn him in to the rock. Your story is not over, friend. If God is calling you, if God is choosing you, if God is asking you to be a disciple, to follow him, don't ever for a second think that just because you're human and you're messy and that you've messed it up and it's too far gone, that God can't use you. Find a person in the Bible, find a person in this book that is not messy. Find a person in this book that is not human, that did not mess things up, did not take things into their own hands, but it has nothing to do with who Simon Peter was, and it had everything to do with who Jesus was. Friend, it has nothing to do with who you are and who you're not and where you feel like you lack. It has everything to do with who God is. It is because of the goodness of God. And if God brings you to it, He will bring you through it. Keep your eyes laser focused on Jesus. Do not get distracted. Do not look to the left or to the right. You will start to sink. Laser focus your eyes on Jesus Christ, and you will be able to walk on water. Remember, it's not who we are. God does not call the qualified. God qualifies the called. It's because of Jesus in us, with us, in front of us, guiding us, loving us, redeeming us, giving us second chances that we can go out and actually truly disciple a nation.